The first time code learned to fall, it landed on the floor of a lab in Cambridge and got back up with a bruise the color of hexadecimal midnight. That was when a handful of stubborn minds decided that gravity should not just be a number in a textbook, but a voice the machine could hear. Long before engines had splash screens and middleware banners, there were chalkboards haunted by the specters of Isaac Newton, Joseph Louis Lagrange, and William Rowan Hamilton. Their symbols were not dead history. They were seeds, and the silicon would grow forests from them. Chris Hecker wrote to game developers like a lighthouse keeper, describing the rocks under the water, warning that rigid bodies are liars unless you interrogate them with honest math. David Baraff arrived through the door from Carnegie Mellon with papers that read like police reports on collisions, complete with Coulomb friction sworn statements and linear complementarity problems presented like arraignments. Brian Mirtich argued with the world at the speed of impulse, and in his equations, you could hear the crisp snap of billiard balls and the weary scrape of crates on concrete. In those rooms, the air felt ionized by ideas, as if a thunderstorm had paused just overhead. The earliest engines were held together by faith in Euler. There is an innocent courage in explicit Euler integration, a childlike willingness to step where the slope points and call it a journey. Then came semi-implicit Euler, a steadier stride for a world that insists on momentum. There were disciples of Runge and Kuta, who would swear that a fourth-order pilgrimage could save you from numerical sin, though the frame budget would extract its tithe. Somewhere, a quiet voice from computational geometry murmured the word symplectic, and those who listened found that energy behaves better when you move to its rhythm instead of your own. Collision detection, the sleepless guardian of plausibility, learned to see before it learned to judge. Broad-phase methods acted like night watchmen on long factory floors, filing suspects by axis-aligned bounding boxes, sweeping and pruning the ledger with ruthless efficiency. Trees of bounding volumes grew like orchards, balanced and rebalanced by algorithms with gardener patience. When the shortlist was made, the narrow phase stepped forward with the rigor of a jeweler's loop. The Gilbert-Johnson-Kearthy algorithm measured the distance between shapes as if it were an argument in a marriage that neither side wanted to escalate. The expanding polytope algorithm finished the thought when penetration became unavoidable, sketching the depth and direction of apology required. The separating axis theorem did not argue. It simply said, find me an axis that proves your innocence, or accept that you are, geometrically speaking, entangled. Names became landmarks. Havoc rose from Dublin with the brisk confidence of a city acquainted with rain and perseverance. Physics arrived through Santa Clara, by way of a company that tried to give physics its own dedicated heart, a card pulsing inside the machine before the green giant folded that beat into the wider rhythm of the graphics processor. Open Dynamics Engine wandered out of the wilderness with Russ Smith's signature and an engineer's grin, willing to do the dirty work for anyone who would wire it into their world. Bullet, from Erwin Koumans, showed up like a black coffee at midnight, plain on the surface, surprisingly generous once you took a sip, and equally welcome in robotics labs and game studios. Box 2D, from Aaron Caddo, turned two-dimensional worlds into playgrounds with puzzles that fit in a phone and taught a generation of designers how friction is not just a coefficient, but a personality. If collisions are the knuckles of the world, constraints are its promises. A hinge says you may spin, but you may not wander. A slider says you may wander, but only along the railway I have laid through your heart. Articulated bodies, those mechanical centipedes of joints and links, needed something gentler than brute force. Roy Featherstone handed us an articulated body method that moved through chains of limbs like a rumor, passing messages efficiently and finishing the calculation with the elegance of a magician revealing an empty hand. Constraint solvers learned to bargain. Gauss and Seidel took turns across the table. Aaron Caddo's sequential impulses turned contact and friction into fast conversations that converged while the frame rate tapped its foot. Projective methods and position-based dynamics, nourished by the work of Matthias Muller and collaborators, stopped arguing about forces and simply adjusted the positions until the world looked right, as if a patient tailor had pinned reality until the suit lay flat. Cloth needed tenderness. Early mass spring systems fluttered like timid birds, tearing when the time step sneezed. Then the work of David Baroff and Andrew Whitkin at Pixar sketched out robust cloth whose wrinkles had opinions. Fluids refused to be bribed by polygons. Joe Stamm taught us stable fluids that would not explode in the night. Smooth particle hydrodynamics lent us a swarm model, where each droplet confided in its neighbors, and position-based fluids later turned splash and slosh into an obedient choir. Soft bodies learned shape matching and the quiet strength of finite elements, and somewhere in a dark theater, a creature rippled with plausible terror because the differential equations behaved. Under it all were numbers that never forgave us. Floating point arithmetic is a necessary lie told with a straight face. The same simulation on two machines would drift like old friends, taking different streets to the same cafe and forgetting to call. Glenn Fiedler wrote an article with a title that reads like, "Advice to Nervous Pilots." Fix your time step. He did not mean to be ominous, but I felt the gravity in his voice. Fixed time steps gave us a metronome for the simulation's heart. Interpolation played therapist between physics and rendering, telling the camera that the world would be okay and that butter smoothness could be faked with enough grace. In games, chaos is not welcome unless it wears a leash. Determinism became the word on the door. Networking code prayed for lockstep and got rollback, a strange religion in which time itself could be asked politely to try again. Fighting games turned input into a pact. The physics engine had to promise that the same punch thrown in Cape Town would land in Tokyo the same way, even as the ocean of latency sloshed between them. People think a physics engine is about gravity. It is also about trust. The engines grew personalities. Havoc became the workhorse that could carry entire open worlds on its back, from cities with suspiciously stacked crates to cathedrals where chandeliers considered their mortality. PhysX flirted with hardware acceleration and later became a citizen of the graphics democracy, where thousands of threads carried tiny buckets of math to the river. Bullet walked freely between film and research, between animation rigs and robotic grip planners, doing its job without drama. ODE kept its honest face, happy to drive a robot dog in a lab where the air smells like solder and coffee. Box 2D, modest and brilliant, became the gravity under games about birds and blocks and stubborn pigs that taught human beings how parabolas feel. When the autonomous vehicle movement rolled its first prototypes onto closed courses, physics engines stood on the sidelines, pretending to be unimportant. Then someone asked how you teach a car to fear a wet road, and simulation shrugged and became indispensable. In simulators like Carla, the world is a careful lie, constructed to teach a machine the difference between caution and paralysis. Physics does not ask for applause, yet it makes the difference between a demonstration and a moral responsibility carried out with precision. In robotics, Gazebo and PyBullet turned laboratories into rehearsals where mistakes could be made safely and often. A robot learned to pick up a tomato without humiliation, because somewhere a constraint solver learned the delicate math of not squeezing too hard. The film world looked across the river and waved. Although visual effects leans on its own libraries, you can hear the echo of game engines in the pipelines that move cloth, debris, and smoke through the frame. The Stanford lineage that touched FizzBam, the research from Ron Fedke and colleagues, the analytic insights from Jernij Barbic and James O'Brien, these all belong to a family reunion where the name tags read physics, and no one argues about whether a scene is cinematic or interactive. Under the hood, they share a thirst for stability, plausibility, and tools that let artists push on reality without breaking it. The mathematics gets darker as the ambition grows. Hamiltonian systems care about symplectic structure the way archivists care about humidity. Break that structure and your simulated solar system will either freeze to death or boil over after a few thousand steps. Time of impact calculations stare down the paradox of objects that move quickly enough to pass through walls in a single frame, and conservative advancement answers with a slow, careful walk up to the precipice of contact. Continuous collision detection is the adult in the room that refuses to allow teleporting bullets. Constraint stabilization fights the ghost of numerical drift, with Baumgarten terms that act like stern teachers putting wandering variables back in their seats. If you are tempted to dismiss all this as entertainment, watch a trainee surgeon practice on a virtual liver that bleeds according to reasonable rules. That surgeon is training a habit the world depends on, and the habit involves a simulation, convincing her nervous system that resistance and give mean something. Watch an architect test a building against a pretend earthquake that is honest enough to be frightening. Watch a rescue drone, trained in synthetic wind, make a decision that saves a human in real wind. Then understand why a field you thought was about breaking wooden barrels in a fantasy town is actually a branch of applied ethics. There is a cost. Realism is not free. The earth pays for every teraflop in heat, and data centers hum like hives that never sleep. Efficient algorithms are not just clever, they are a moral choice. Broad-faced techniques that cull a million impossible collisions are not only the engineer's pride, they are a small mercy for a planet with rivers that need their own electricity. Sparse solvers, cache-friendly data layouts, branchless code paths that treat the processor kindly, all of this lives somewhere between aesthetic and obligation. There are darker stories too. When physics engines teach you that smashing is beautiful, it is easy to forget that in the non-simulated world, breaking things has a real inventory line and sometimes a body count. Designers carry that weight. They know that gravity is not a toy, and that a fall in a game is a study in catharsis, while a fall in life is a knock on a door at midnight. Good designers learn to build worlds that let you exercise the desire to push against the rules without making cruelty into a mascot. What fascinates me is how the engines rearranged computer science itself. Data-oriented design elbowed its way in, insisting that arrays of structures turn into structures of arrays so that the processor could feast on contiguous memory. Parallelism stopped being a theory exam and became a matter of survival, because constraints prefer to be solved together, like a choir, not alone, like monks. Deterministic builds became legal contracts between machines. Testing frameworks learned to watch for numerical explosions with the patience of a zookeeper. Even the standard library felt different when you realized that a tiny allocation in the middle of a hot loop is not a footnote, but a saboteur. There is poetry in the low-level details. A contact manifold is a collection of whispered truths about where two bodies insist they are touching. Warm starting gives the solver the memory of a previous argument, so the current one does not start from first principles. Restitution is a personality trait, a number that says how bouncy you feel on a cold morning. Friction is more than a coefficient. It is a relationship that resists motion until it fails, and once it fails, it weakly regrets the decision. Stack stabilization is a diplomatic effort carried out between bricks that would prefer to sink into one another if left unsupervised. When Epic began to write its own chaos, it was not an act of rebellion, but of necessity. The scale of worlds had grown too large to rent gravity from a neighbor. Unity welcomed PhysX like a respected partner, then invested in dots and data-oriented pipelines, because the worlds people wanted to build were too big for the old covenant between objects and messages. Even the humble mobile game demanded honesty from physics. The phone in your hand became an accelerometer that tattled about your movements to a game that held you to account. The untold story is that physics engines changed how we think about cause and effect. They smuggled intuition into millions of minds. A child who flings a digital bird is not only learning about angle and power, they are learning an embodied lesson about differential equations disguised as a toy. A level designer who adjusts a friction coefficient until the slide feels right is practicing experimental science in a lab where time can be rewound and rewound again. A robotics student who tunes a constraint until the gripper's touch is trustworthy is learning empathy for the physical world, a respect that might echo in how she treats non-simulated creatures later. There's a thin red line running from Newton's apple to a modern GPU kernel that resolves thousands of contacts in parallel. Along that line are coffee stains at the Game Developers Conference, chalk dust at MIT, quiet offices at Stanford, busy hallways at Trinity College Dublin, and all the nameless places where people decided that the world should be allowed to push back inside a computer. I've watched teams argue about whether to cheat for fun, and I've watched them refuse to cheat because the player would notice. Honesty is expensive. The bill is paid with cleverness and with nights that run long. The future is already rehearsing. Differentiable physics promises gradients that flow through collisions, tutoring learning systems in how to place their feet on uncertain ground. Hybrid solvers dance between position and velocity space, to pick the benefits of both. New cloth models treat fibers like societies with micro rules that create macro grace. Fluids negotiate with rendering so that a spray can be both physically faithful and visually generous. Distributed simulations practice the fine art of pretending that several computers are one mind. If all of that sounds like science fiction, remember that yesterday's fiction is what engines do while you sleep. If you want one rule in this craft, it is this: the world inside your program must feel inevitable. Not correct in the courtroom sense, though that is noble, but inevitable in the heartbeat sense. When a crate lands, the sound and the motion should agree that fate has been consulted. When a rope snaps, it should betray the same helplessness you feel when a storm takes the power down. If you achieve that, you will have taught a machine to tell stories that hands and eyes can believe. The story is never simply about falling and bouncing. It is about the contract between expectation and surprise, which is to say, it is about being alive. So here we are, decades after the first digital box met the first digital floor. We have engines that can break cities like dry bread, that can cradle cloth like a sleeping cat, that can teach a drone to hover in a quarrelsome wind. We have engines that can carry moral weight and commercial weight without buckling. We have a generation of programmers who read Christer Erikson on collision detection the way poets read meter, and a generation of artists who know that a hinge can be a character if you tune it right. The untold story is a simple confession. Physics engines did not only make worlds plausible, they made us better readers of the one real world we have, by letting us rehearse the consequences of force and time until our intuition became sharp enough to handle the truth. And if, on some night, you hear a small noise from your machine room, a soft scrape followed by a delicate clatter, do not be alarmed. Somewhere in there, a rigid body learned a new regret. A cloth found a better fold. A fluid discovered how to wrap itself around a stone. The engines are not alive. Not really. They only practice life with such devotion that for a heartbeat, you might believe otherwise. That heartbeat is worth everything.